Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
Well, here we are. We've been teasing this one for a long time.
Yes, we have. You know, I definitely I agree with you. You need to fix your hair. We might have some folks listening to this and watching us on YouTube on this episode.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so we've been talking about feeding and implications for turkeys. We've done some stuff already. It's among the top most requested topics for us to cover in detail.
Which surprises me a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's enough information out there, and people realize that that this is an important issue because, a lot of people are engaged in some form of feeding or baiting, and it's legal in a lot of the states.
Yeah.
So I do want to make it clear we're not pointing fingers at anybody or trying to point blame or anything. You're doing what you're allowed within your legal right if you're one of those people. This isn't about that. This is more about us understanding all of the different things that could be influencing turkeys, and we've tried to do a deep dive and dig up as much information as we can about the feeding issue.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are interested in it because, like you said, a lot of people engage in it, but they've heard enough noise around this topic that they want to fully understand what it is that they're getting involved with. And I've even had a couple listeners reach out to me and send me messages asking, I typically run like a 2-week trail camera survey. Even had a friend, a fellow biologist, contact me and said that he has had some landowners recently contact him being concerned about the negative effects of using corn to run a 2-week trail camera survey. And I said, if we're talking about mitigating risk down to zero, then that's probably something that we would avoid. But we're in the real world, and it's most likely that people that are just putting corn out to run a 2-week deer survey so that they can identify which bucks they may want to shoot that year based on their criteria, or to try to manage the doe population, then that's really probably not contributing much to any problems that we may be experiencing related to turkeys and corn.
Well, and I think people will know after we get done with this, hopefully, but, there's probably a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
Those kinds of efforts and using it as a utility, to try to get better information for, your management on your property is very different than sustained use or, using it at particularly vulnerable times or, some of the topics that we'll, I'm sure, get into, a couple of week survey at, late in the summer is pretty inconsequential given the, the other things that are occurring across the landscape.
Well, and to be fully transparent, you and I even use corn bait for turkeys as part of our research, but in our capture efforts. But typically, that's done during the wintertime when it's not as conducive to growing toxins, and also it's there for a limited period of time. It's not something that we're using year round. But I think
I think that's a good point. I mean, there's justifiable reasons to use it for to help you accomplish objectives.
Right.
I don't think we would catch many turkeys without that approach.
Right. Absolutely.
But so it's the same like you if you're surveying deer, that's a well-established method to do so.
Right. But I think this is a prime time of the year to be talking about it because a lot of people are starting to want to survey their deer. They're wanting to start, concentrating deer movements for hunting season where it's legal. So you see a
Hmm.
lot of feed going out on the ground this time of year.
Yeah. Well, so we've had several approaches to trying to get information about this and think about the implications of feeding for turkeys from as many perspectives. And one of the things that I wanted to do, and I even got my postdoc David Mason to help, is try to just understand the scale, like how much feed is going out.
Yeah, and that's one of
I
those
don't know.
things we just kind of wave our hands at usually, and we're like,
Yeah,
it's a lot.
yeah, but
But you've got
we say a
numbers.
lot. Yeah, I found a few numbers. David found some. Uh, they're from reputable sources, as far as we can tell. Uh, yeah, I when I've asked a lot of people that question, and people ask me that question, and my typical response or what I hear is like, well, all the landowners I go on are doing it,
Right.
or a really high percentage, at least in the southeast. It seems to be uh, fairly restricted to the southeastern U.S. in terms of the prevalence.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure there are people, using feeding in different parts of the range of turkeys as well.
Sure.
So, but I kind of have some notes on things that David and I found when we were looking, just trying to get a handle on scale. Like, let me see some numbers, right?
Right.
So again, I'm not pointing fingers at states. That just happens to be where we found some information that we felt like we could share,
Mm-hmm.
where they have some data.
Right.
So the states that we mention are not because they're the problem or any other way. That's not the point of this. We just have some data from there.
Yeah, and I think another important point to make in regards to that is that in most states, the decision on the legality of placing feed, whether it's to be hunted over or not, rests outside the hands of the biologist in that state agency.
Mm-hmm.
That's a legislative matter.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. So, and again, you're all welcome to do whatever you want to within your legal right. It's none of my business, but I feel like we should all be educated, and that's why we try to dig up some stuff. So, I guess we could just do it chronologically. So, there have been a few surveys from some states
Mm-hmm.
trying to get a handle on participation in some form of feeding, whether it be baiting or supplemental feeding or both.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Probably the way that some of these are worded would include people who are doing camera surveys, and that's all
Mm-hmm.
that they would use feed for. But some of them certainly do not include that. The first one I'll go to is South Carolina DNR. They have it currently on their website. We found this article, and we're summarizing it here. But it's a survey was done in 2006. They had really high participation. This was from the Deer Quota program, it looks like, from the DNR. This is also another reason I know a lot of people are a little bit resistant to. I hear it, at least. I never hear the opposing view, so we'll just assume that's uh, the sentiment from people or hunters. A lot of people might be resistant to filling out surveys from the state agency, but they're using it in aggregate like this, and it can give us really important information. So if you're getting
Right.
surveys from your state agency, that's not so they can figure out what you're doing on your 40, it's so that they can look at things in aggregate and have good information. So that's kind of what this is. About 77% of the program participants, I think that's the Deer Quota program they're talking about, completed this survey.
So these are landowners that potentially they sign up for this program and they receive
Mm-hmm.
additional tags for participation to manage
Yeah.
the doe population where they
Yeah.
hunt.
So so generally they are either landowners or at least
Right.
leasing land together, and they're in this program with the state. Yep. So the 77% completed the survey, and that they estimated that was direct data for about 3 million acres of habitat.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it was focused in the low country. 94% of the respondents indicated that, this is the way that they worded it, they bait or supplemental feed on their property. So 94%.
Wow.
That was in 2006.
But so it was restricted to the low country of South Carolina.
It's not real clear. They
Okay.
probably have this survey public somewhere on their website. We did not find that. We found what they have, the article that they have on it.
The reason I asked that is that I know that that baiting for deer specifically has been legal in the low country for much longer than it has in the upstate of South Carolina. So it's probably more culturally ingrained there.
Right. So yeah, and it would have been legal at this time.
Right.
There.
94%.
94% is what they said. Yep. On average, they were engaged in that practice for about 7.6 months per property.
What?
Of the year. Yep.
Now, that actually surprises me more than the percentage that are participating in the practice.
Yeah, it's a long-term endeavor in terms of the calendar year.
Wow.
Which their deer season's also really, really long.
Yeah, I guess in the low country they have an August rifle season.
Yeah.
I believe.
So, but there's actually data on this. 85% of the participants, I can't even speak now, indicated that bait was available outside of deer season.
Wow.
So 85% are doing it outside of the deer season.
Okay.
This was according to the survey of this community of people, 15 years ago. So, I don't know how things have changed, but this is the data we could find.
Right.
A little more recent, there was a similar type of survey done in Arkansas, and it was of the deer clubs in 2011. 89% of the hunters on private land fed deer at some point during the year. 96% of those were using corn.
Mm-hmm. No big surprise there.
Yeah.
I mean, again, it's a high number, but I wouldn't be surprised that...
I wouldn't have said 90%, though.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't have.
Especially that long ago.
Yeah.
It's 2011. So there is yet a more recent from the FWC in Florida. Their participation is actually lower than those other ones overall, and they have it broken up. Let's see.
And baiting for deer has been legal in Florida for a very long time, right?
Yeah. Yes, it has. There were some interesting things. They had it worded differently, which is why the participation could be lower.
Mm-hmm.
It was talking about just maintaining wildlife feeders. That was the way that it was presented. So that people might interpret that as year round.
Yeah.
I don't know. So the striking thing, though, that to me about this is, so the percentages were relatively low, but it's broken up by landowner size classes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the question was, do you maintain a feeder on your property?
Yes, that's what we have copied. It says maintain wildlife feeders, and then it has property sizes and percentages of the participants in the survey that responded yes. So we have less than 50 acres, 50 to 500 acres, and then greater than 501 acres were the three categories. Which one of those categories do you think had the highest participation in wildlife feeding?
I'm torn because I have two hypotheses.
Okay, let's hear them.
Initially, I thought, well, it's probably the larger landowners that are participating in feeding at a higher rate because I just think larger property, maybe they have more expendable income. It's an expensive practice, and that's kind
Hmm.
of my logic there. But then smaller landowners also, I could see, having a greater incentive to feed to keep animals concentrated on their property.
Yeah.
So
I
which,
had the same thing. I kind
yeah,
of leaned towards smaller landowners because they're trying to compete with their neighbors,
yeah,
kind of deal.
sure,
And it's harder to get, that deer to stand on your 25
sure,
acres or whatever. So, but your instinct, it sounds like we're correct. The 501 plus size properties, it was almost 50%, so 46 and a half.
okay,
And then the middle category was a little over a third, and then the less than 50 acres, a little less than a third. We're
okay.
again maintaining wildlife feeders.
But I'm surprised that number was so much lower than South Carolina and Arkansas. Like you said, it may
Yeah,
have been related to how they phrased the question, but
yeah, and that's one thing. There are people that spend their career trying to figure out how to develop instruments like this
yeah,
to survey people so that the questions are clear and don't mislead them into answering incorrectly. Or
right.
it's really it is a science in and of itself. So uh, tweaks to the language could influence it, but the important thing to me is we're trying to get a handle on the scale,
Hmm.
and that's just 3 data points. I did talk to Bronson, and they had a big study going on in Mississippi.
Hmm.
It's They don't have the data collated yet, but it seemed like in terms of the density of feeders within their study area, at least during that time, it was lower than some of these other numbers I'm going to tell you.
Hmm.
So it does vary across states and probably within a state substantially in some cases.
Yeah.
So with the FWC report, even with that rate of feeding, that still averages 2 feeders per property.
Wow.
So based on their surveys. So we can bounce around between these because we're trying to cover different topics related to it. But this is the one that kind of was like a what? Wait a minute, what? I
This is the
did.
one you probably texted me about last night with the
Yeah,
mind blown
when I
emoji,
read it, I was like, "Do what?"
which to be clear, I haven't heard it yet. I told Marcus to wait.
Yeah. So we'll go back to this South Carolina DNR report on a per square mile basis annually. How much feed do you think was going out?
Oh,
They estimated it based
like
on the survey.
pounds per square mile.
Yeah, or you can whatever unit you need to put it in.
Alabama's.
How many Alabamas a quarter?
Uh,
I'm putting you on the spot. Let's see how far you are off.
ton.
Ton,
I'll go with
yeah,
tons.
whatever pounds or tons or whatever you want to do per square mile.
Pounds per square mile, if I had to guess, in the low country of South Carolina.
It doesn't explicitly say low country, but I think it does say lower coastal plain somewhere in the document.
But it's somewhere in South Carolina, and it's pounds per
Yeah, they
square
said
mile on
representative of coastal plain. That's what they say.
on hunted properties in the coastal plain.
Yeah,
Oh
and I
gosh.
think they're specifically in the quota program.
And this is per year? Pounds per square mile per year?
Yes. Yep.
1,000.
1,000 pounds.
Yeah.
You're only one order of magnitude off.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, they estimated, and this was in 2006, 10,600 pounds per square mile.
How is that even possible?
5 tons.
5 tons per square mile on properties that are hunted in the coastal plain of South Carolina
Yeah.
per year.
Mm-hmm. that works out. They did the math on this, not me. So if the math is wrong, it's not I didn't make the calculations. 342 pounds per square mile per week. Based on how, the average amount of time that people are feeding, or 43 pounds per square mile per day.
43 pounds per square mile per day.
So a sack of corn in every square mile per day, every day of the year.
Oh my God.
Did the mind blow emoji fit that metric? 'Cause to
It
me,
did, and
that's a
clearly
little bit.
I'm not even in the right tax bracket to be putting out that much corn.
Well, interestingly, we found a couple of references.
Man, it's been so long since I've bought a bag of corn. I don't even know what a bag of corn goes for anymore.
I honestly don't either, but I hear people complain about it. But what we did find in one of these surveys, and some of them, we found articles about the survey and couldn't get the actual survey, or the source that we would have to reference we can't validate, and we can't find the survey kind of deal. So we're not going to cover some of those things. There is some more survey data from other states that we just haven't been able to track down. But one of the things I feel comfortable sharing is in one of those surveys, they asked people what the main barrier was, and it was financial.
The main barrier to feeding?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
well, I looked it up right now. My local Tractor Supply has whole corn for $13 per 50-pound bag. So if they're putting a bag out a day per square mile, that's $4,700 per square mile per year.
yeah.
Man,
It's
imagine.
a lot of money.
Please don't come at me about thinning to a lower basal area to benefit turkeys and giving up some timber revenue if you're spending $4,700 per year per square mile on corn.
Yeah. So they estimated total bait sites were in excess of 30,000 from that survey. That's what they were, 30,000. And that equated, based on their, them trying to figure out what the density looked like, to one site per 116 acres, or in other words, about 6 per square mile.
Wow.
On average, one for every 422 yards.
Yeah, I wish we could have numbers elsewhere and see how they stack up, but I mean, that's
and more recent, because a lot of places have legalized feeding and baiting and everything since this came out. So we don't know if the scale has changed. It certainly has probably gained steam across a larger land area just because of policy changes.
I would like to, and maybe they asked some of this in that survey, but I would like to know what people's primary motivations are for putting that much out. Like, is it all just to attract deer for harvest, or is it, I also feel like,
The
the
Florida
boom.
survey, that I talked about, that was from 2020, so it's pretty recent. They do it like every 5 years or something, and it says the past 5 years. But darn, I don't have the. I don't think I grabbed this particular quote, but I read it. It was something. It was addressing what you're talking about. It was something like they do it as a wildlife improvement, or I can't remember the term that they used, but it was indicating they were using it to increase health.
They're feeding
wildlife
them.
health.
They feel like they're feeding them, improving their diet.
That was one of the principal things, and then of course attraction for concentrating animals is probably another major.
Sure,
draw.
and that's the one that we talk about the most. I feel like is obviously a lot of this is being put out to try to improve hunting success. But one of the things or the uses that I don't feel like we talk about very often, if at all, is that the trail camera revolution, I think, has probably prompted a lot of people, even in places where you can't hunt over bait, to put it out, to increase the number of photographs that they get.
Yeah. Well, and I think
I mean,
You know,
20 something years ago, we were still using film cameras, you know?
I know. I remember doing it
I
when
did it too.
when I was a teenager. I was using film cameras.
D batteries or those old lantern
Yeah,
batteries that
I
ran them.
remember. I can remember very vividly. I was like, man, I cannot wait to get one of these cameras that runs on double A's.
I
That
know.
was the big thing,
I know. You remember taking your 35 millimeter film to the 1 hour photo to get developed from your trail camera,
Yes, excited as I could be about it.
and then you'd stand around, shop for an hour or something, come back over there, pick them up, and you got 10 photos of a doe and a fawn on your mineral lick, and the rest of it's all just squirrels coming by.
Yeah, no, I remember all that, but I think you're right that a lot of people are probably using it to concentrate activity in front of a camera so they can monitor what's
Yeah,
going on. Like people want to see their bucks growing or,
yeah.
their turkey strutting or whatever.
Hmm.
And, now with the revolutions and technology where you can even do that remotely,
Yeah.
it's probably being done somewhat for that purpose. I
So do you
think
have any more data on the scope and scale?
there are a few things, yeah. They said due to the scope of that program in South Carolina, both in acreage and distribution of properties, it is believed that the results of that survey are representative of the coastal plain in general. It said extrapolating that to yields for the region, that would be 80,000 bait sites, 2.3 million bushels of corn, specifically corn, with a value at the time, which they calculated based on $8 per bushel, of 18.6 million, which is not quite double that now, based on you
Hmm.
said it was $13 a sack.
Yeah,
So that's a lot.
that's a lot.
I think about it too in my experience. Um, you know, a feeder per 100 acres, I think is probably pretty
Hmm.
consistent.
Yeah,
I've been on a bunch of properties in a bunch of states, and I'd say that's pretty consistent,
right.
just based on my anecdotal experience.
Yeah, I would too. It seems very reasonable, but man, I wonder. I think probably some of the more interesting work that we could do on this is digging deeper into what people's intentions are for putting that out.
Mhm.
Obviously, if it's attracting animals for viewing by camera or person and harvest, then there's not. I mean, it works, right?
Mhm.
But I mean, the improving wildlife health aspect of it is what's most surprising to me because I typically don't think of people putting corn out and being under the impression that they're growing more turkeys or bigger bucks. Do you?
No, but I don't know, when we were talking to Dr. Dunning about this, I was trying to we bounced all over the place in that
Yeah.
episode. And, I one thing that I've just this has been bouncing around in my head, it's kinda related to the stuff you brought up about the predator issue.
Mhm.
Like, is it not just ingrained, and I'm talking about just in general in humans, to
Mhm.
wanna feed stuff?
It is.
Like, what do
Absolutely.
you wanna do if you go to the zoo? My 2-year-old, if I take her to the zoo, she wants to feed the giraffe.
We got to
That's
feed the
just
giraffe.
I know, and I'm with her. It's
I
fun.
know.
I wanna feed
Yeah.
it.
Heck yeah.
Let's see it eat that lettuce. Come on now.
I mean, we've got a daggum store in town that all they sell is bird seed and bird feeders. We have
Mhm.
a whole store set up around
Yeah,
that.
I
People,
have one less than a mile from my residence.
yeah, people love to feed critters.
Yeah. So I wonder if some of it is just, we just like to feed stuff and see wildlife respond to things that we're doing that and I'm right there. I like that too. I really enjoy planting a food plot and
Mhm.
seeing deer and turkeys just all over it,
Yeah.
just wearing it out.
That's such immediate positive feedback too,
Yeah.
with corn especially, right? Because
Mhm.
you spend $13 and $13 in gas to drive out, and pour out a bag of corn and change the batteries out, change SD card out, and a few hours later you got deer showing up on camera again.
Mhm.
It's like they wanted it. They obviously like it a lot. I mean, why
Yeah.
wouldn't it benefit them?
Exactly.
Then you get that immediate positive feedback versus a lot of the more complicated things that we recommend to enhance populations.
Mhm. So I think one thing that I'm realizing after going through this, and we're still doing more work on it. We've got a lot of ground to cover here, I think, but that's kind of one of the parts of this whole thing that I think is necessary for us to try to put it in context.
Yeah,
How ubiquitous is this? We still don't have very good data, I don't think, unless we just didn't find it.
yeah,
Uh, like we have a couple of surveys referenced here from 3 states.
right.
Uh, we did have a little bit of information from 2 or 3 other ones, and I didn't feel real good about the way we would have to source it because we
Hmm.
couldn't find the document or
Right.
article from the agency that collected the data on it. Which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We just didn't find it yet.
Yeah.
Um, the one thing that sticks out to me, and I think it was from a Georgia survey. It was around the time that the initial feeding law, whatever they called that, uh,
When they
it was
legalized
right.
hunting over bait.
Yeah, it was a few years before, because wasn't it like 2009 or 10 or something like
Yes.
that? Um, so it was before. It was like 5 years before that. There was a survey. It may have been 6 or 8 years before that. There was a survey just of hunters, and one of the questions was asking if they if feeding was an acceptable practice or baiting was an acceptable
Hmm.
practice or something like that. It was very low based on we don't have we haven't found the source yet, but based on the article we found related to it, the acceptance was very low, like in 20% range, give or take.
Yeah.
Um, and then according to this article, there was a follow up survey with similar question after, let's see, 2013, I think was the year,
Hmm.
and that went to 60 something percent acceptance.
Wow.
It was a big change,
It
just
changed
like
that
that.
rapidly.
Yeah. So the practice and acceptance of the practice is definitely changing over time. I think we know that
Yeah.
it's being widely applied. At what scale and how ubiquitous and how much that varies from place to place is not known. I don't
It's
think.
weird how there's been this cultural shift, at least in the Southeast. Obviously, that's the area that we're most familiar with because both of us grew up hunting here. And I'm sure you remember just like I do that when we were kids first starting out hunting, everybody would speak in whispers about this one guy that that hunts over
Hmm.
on this back 40 somewhere, and he's like, kills deer more regularly than everybody else, and they're like, oh, he puts out corn, and it was just kind of like this
Hmm.
very hush hush thing. And even in states that are where it's legal now, in those few years that preceded its legalization, it just got to be a thing that people would just joke about, like, "Oh, I'm just putting this out for my trail cameras, wink, wink,"
Hmm.
and it had become like, not legalized, but almost people were treating it like it was decriminalized. That's a
Hmm.
term floating around a lot right now. I know relative to some other things, but it didn't have the stigma
Hmm.
that it once
Oh,
did.
when I was a kid, it definitely had a stigma.
I mean, it was right up there
That.
with spotlighting a deer.
Hmm. Yep. I
But
think that definitely is changing.
right. And I think part of the reason that people are so accepting of it, and you and I have had this conversation before, is that we have not done a good job as wildlife biologists and wildlife researchers of providing solid data or evidence on why they shouldn't.
Mhm.
A lot of people, I think, feel like it boils down to an ethical argument. And
Yeah.
that's why you hear a lot of times, well, I feel like my corn pile is just, my version, a poor man's version of a food plot. I don't have acres to
Mhm.
plant food plots, or I don't have equipment or whatever. Like, what's the difference? I'm attracting game for viewing and harvest, and they aren't aware of any other negative potential side effects because we don't have data. And we're going to go into a lot of this stuff in subsequent episodes about
Mhm.
potential effects, but I cannot show you data that demonstrates that putting out corn decreases a average buck's gross Boone and Crockett score, or it decreases pulp per hen ratios by this
Mhm.
percent. We don't have that.
Yeah. We don't have direct causation data,
Right.
and is that is a problem.
And it's going to be difficult, very difficult to ever get.
Yeah, it's hard to do, but the other thing is, we with a practice like this, that was one of the things that I was trying to do this for is like, well, depending on the scale of it, is it even something to worry about?
I think we've addressed that question.
Well, I think so too, but I'm just saying that's something that I think that's a really good and logical thought process.
Yeah.
Is it? I mean, at this, here's a number I got from.
No, you're right. You chose the right starting point on all this.
Yeah, I mean, is it relevant? And then I was like, okay, they wrote this in this article. Let's see. They were looking at it from the point of view of a deer, but they were just saying, okay, if the average deer had a 1 square mile home range, then they would have access to between 5 and 6 bait sites every deer,
Mm-hmm.
and or on average, I guess. Um, and then I was like, well, turkeys are, we if that is representative of the landscape, then we could be talking about nearly all turkeys outside of public lands where it's still prohibited. Nearly all of them have access to it, and they're going to use it.
Mm-hmm. And you've seen pretty extensive use of bait sites by turkeys on one of your field sites, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
You can
I
see it
mean,
in the GPS
and
data.
like everybody that has a feeder with turkeys knows that they come and eat at it. I mean,
Right.
so there's not, to me, there's still a question of how ubiquitous the practice is, but we have lots of evidence from different angles to suggest it's probably something that we need to look at.
Well, you've taken it from us just saying it's a lot to it's
Yeah.
really a lot. I mean, it's
Yeah.
evidently
At
a lot.
least in a couple of surveys in a couple of places,
Right.
the scale suggests that, uh, this is something that could be at a large scale relevant to turkey populations.
Right. So now that we've established that, the next step would be for us to move on and look into, what are some of the potential consequences of that.
Yeah. I agree. And it was quite interesting to me the proportion, the couple of them, it was 90 something percent, right? The proportion of the feed that is corn. I kind of was taken back by that too. I felt like it sort of took a back seat from
Hmm.
the spotlight in terms of our numbers,
Yeah.
but I don't know. I just thought there was a lot more focus on protein feeding, I guess.
Yeah, like pelleted feed.
Yeah. It
I would have
seems like there
imagined
is.
I would have imagined that that was in the small minority.
Well, I mean, especially in some of these populations, like some of these uh, big deer clubs or whatever,
Hmm.
I would expect them to be really trying to increase protein availability
Right.
throughout.
Right.
So, and the way the questions were worded, it may not have it could be that there's also some corn mixed in, or sometimes there's corn used, and then they would say
Mm-hmm.
they're all using corn when they're actually principally feeding protein. Like
Yeah,
it's hard to determine, at this kind of scale. But what I think it does establish pretty well is that the practice is uh, probably widespread enough that it's definitely something we need to look at with turkeys.
absolutely. I mean, I think we knew that going into this conversation, but now we have better numbers on it than we did.
Yeah, for sure. So I know that's probably not what people want to hear, but to me that's a good thing. How easy is it for you to change, you know, if we find out, oh crap, this is linked to a bunch of problems. How easy is it to fix, right?
Hmm.
Like every landowner could just not do it.
That's a heck of a lot easier than, and less costly, actually cost savings compared to trying to address something more complicated like habitat.
Mhm. Yeah, especially at the scales.
And the one thing that has always concerned me a little bit about this whole issue, and like I said, we don't have hard data on this, but we do have a lot of, you know, correlational data or smoking gun type data
Mhm.
that gives me cause for concern that we're going to go into. But in a lot of states we saw, and it could be completely coincidental. Like, just don't quote me on this. In other words,
Well,
but
not as a causation, but it's
not as a
certainly.
causation, but it would, and it could have been completely coincidental. To repeat myself, but a lot of states that started experiencing declines in harvest about the time that these states that have recently legalized corn have done so.
Mhm. Yeah, when over that 10-year period we talked about where we had a dramatic change in the one survey. Yeah, I don't
And when you
remember
think
which
about the
which state that
evidence
was in, but
that we have and will present on how having that much feed across the landscape alters the ecology of the system,
mhm,
I think it's going to be hard for you to. I think it's going to be hard for anyone to listen to that and not, raise their eyebrows at least a little bit.
yeah. At a minimum, we need to explore this and just figure it out. Like, what are the implications? And I really hope there aren't problems with it. I hope these different data points that we have are not having a big effect on turkeys, but we need to know one way or another.
Hmm.
And if it is, then we need to decide how to deal with it. Which, at least with this particular thing, it's fairly easy to address at the property level. So,
Yeah, and the other interesting thing about this is I imagine there was very little thought given towards turkeys when decisions were being made relative to
mhm,
legalization of baiting
yep.
in these
That,
states that
as
have.
far as I know, the only things that came up about turkeys are the potential consequences.
Yeah.
Like, there's definitely it wasn't driving the decision in a positive direction.
Well, most of the conversations that I heard in Georgia when this was being discussed, and I was still there, were related to the ethics of it, of course,
Hmm.
and then, concentrating deer at feed sites and increasing potential for disease risk,
Right. It
which are
was
all
centered around deer
right.
and ethics.
Yeah. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of discussion about other species at the time, and I mean, heck, we were at that point in time harvesting record numbers of turkeys
Yeah.
or near.
Yeah. Right. So they weren't a part of the conversation for the most part.
Right.
So, uh, another thing, I know you've heard Mark McConnell has talked about this, and I think he's making a pretty good point. And, regulating ethics is probably not the right way to go about anything. It's, including this issue.
Yeah.
And, if I can find that survey showing the change in viewpoints, I mean, that's a good example of why.
Right.
Like, the acceptance of practices
Right.
change.
Right.
And, if we've kind of swung that pendulum where most people were good with it, then why wouldn't there be a strong opposition to regulating what should be ethical for people that
I agree.
find something ethical?
I agree.
So
So we're not going forward going to try to address that ethical argument at all. I mean, we may mention it now and then, but that's not what we're here for.
yeah, it's none of like people have the right to do what's within their legal means, and they're choosing. Everybody has their own set of ethics.
Right.
It's a phenomenal book on that. It was written almost 100 years ago now. The Land Ethic. So with Sand County Almanac.
Right.
But everybody has their own ethics based on their own upbringing and experience and everything. So that's not what it's about. But I think if there are physiological or ecological ramifications, that making sure people are aware of them so that they can choose what to do based on that, that's a different thing.
Well, I mean, it's just, you say if there are ecological ramifications, just going by the South Carolina numbers, if they're putting out 50 pounds of corn per square mile per day, how can that not change the ecology of the system?
It does.
But we just the important thing to think about it is how and how does that potentially affect turkeys?
Right. One, we shouldn't rule out that it could provide additional energy that could be beneficial.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why I'm saying it does have an effect. Whether or not it is of consequence that is concerning to turkeys, I think is a little less certain.
Right.
But the data points that we have, the argument's always centered around aflatoxins, but the data that we do have are strongly suggestive that it's probably not good.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know we're going to get into a lot more discussion about aflatoxin, but as you and I were talking about just a minute ago, before we started recording, you're not going to deal with a large grain and not have aflatoxin.
Right.
It's going to be there.
I can add a couple of little tidbits.
Little teasers, if you will.
Yeah. From the Arkansas study, they did sample field samples. Well, actually, they did in the store. So this was from 2011 again. 51 samples from the store. So just like sampling sacks that were in a retail store, does not say anything other than that. And also 151 field samples, which seem to be associated with real feeders out in the wild in somebody's place or something. 10 of the 51 straight out of the retail stores were positive. That ranged from 5.2 parts per billion to 476 parts per billion.
That's already getting up there before it's even been put out.
Yeah, just to give you, they put this in there, and I'll just read you off this. I have a lot of, we probably need an aflatoxin episode specifically. Yeah. We might even need to bring in a mycotoxin expert to talk through it because there's a lot of data on that. Not specifically to wild turkeys, but there's a lot of data that's relevant to them, and a lot of it is on domesticated wild turkeys.
Well, because aflatoxin, aflatoxin is a major concern in the poultry industry.
Yes. In fact, one of the numbers I read it off to you, it was estimated in 25% of the world's food supply is contaminated with mycotoxins, but that was like 20 years ago. So this is why there's so much on aflatoxin, because it's a really important thing in our food system.
Yeah.
So, and there's been a ton of work, and I don't know how it's affected that over the past couple of decades, but there are people that have made a career over studying how to make our food system more safe and robust to mycotoxins. So I don't know how that's changed, but it did note that the aflatoxins are particularly significant, causing losses to the poultry industry and I keep saying wild turkeys. Domesticated turkeys are particularly sensitive in the poultry species.
Did you come across anything as you were doing this initial lit review? Um, well, I've heard a lot in the past that the corn that is sold as deer corn or wildlife corn, you know what I'm talking about? The stuff that's
Hmm.
labeled like in an academy,
Yeah.
that is labeled as wildlife corn. Is there any truth to that being corn that has higher levels of aflatoxin because it can't be sold into the human food industry or the livestock feed industry?
I don't have the data in front of me. I've
And I
heard the
imagine it
same
varies a
argument.
lot by product and manufacturer
Yeah.
and all that.
And it probably by place, and it's probably also changed over time.
Yeah.
So I remember seeing a presentation from a scientist that was working on this issue that talked about that kind of thing and
Mhm.
how it was making it through. In this one, they put a note in here that there were 20 parts per billion is considered too high for consumption by pets, immature animals, or to feed to dairy cows.
Wow.
300 parts per billion is too high to feed to livestock.
And corn piles typically go over 400 parts in a few days, right?
The ones in the store, there were some that were over 400,
Mm.
and they tested the 151 field samples. This is from the Arkansas. Out of the 151 field samples, 39 were positive, and they range from 5.3 parts per billion to 897 parts per
Right.
billion.
Well, I feel like we're starting to get too far into the weeds on the
Yeah,
aflatoxin side of things. We need to try to lay that out into
yeah.
a
We have
very
we have a
cohesive episode.
well, we have a bunch of other studies on that. That was just part of this survey
Right.
that we were covering today. But the point is the feeding the aflatoxins are usually associated with grain and corn in particular, and that's the primary thing that the majority of hunters in many places seem to be putting out.
Mhm.
And we know that those are commonly testing at levels that are unsafe for wildlife in general and animals in general and us, but also uh, probably turkeys are particularly sensitive, especially young turkeys.
And there's probably even more of it out there on the landscape than we probably realize.
Probably so.
Those South Carolina numbers, I tell you what, man, those are shocking.
Yeah. So another thing, just well, yeah, I'm struggling with how much to provide right now since we've got an episode planned on this, but we do have data on what causes problems in wild turkeys. There is a study on that where they challenged them with the aflatoxins. There's also we have one resource that kind of collated a bunch of information, and it does seem that uh, deer are fairly insensitive, and ruminants are in general. Which
Mhm.
I know I talked about that a little bit, but also they noted that birds and monogastric mammals are susceptible, much more so than ruminants.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean that issue is one that comes up the most commonly, and we have very good data connecting feeding to unsafe levels as far as we know from all this data,
Right.
and we know turkeys eat it.
Right.
So, it's not quite that smoking gun, but that's I think why that focus stays there. But it's not
Yeah.
the only issue, and we're going to talk about other things for people to
Well,
know about.
yeah. Well, I look forward to getting. Well, I don't know that I look forward to it, but I think
I,
it's going to be good stuff
yeah,
to inform people on,
yeah,
and
it's
and for
important
me to become more
information.
informed.
Yeah, it's important information for people to think about and try to understand the scale, like we talked about today. I did not enjoy going through this. I don't
Yeah.
like thinking about this because it's uh, definitely of concern to me.
Man, it's such a tough issue too because the people that are putting corn out, they're not they're good and they're well intentioned, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of them, this is something that is deeply ingrained cultural tradition for them.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of money behind it. I mean, there's obviously an industry, a huge industry behind trying to feed wildlife. So this is not one that's easily disentangled at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other thing, if folks out there, if you know, like if you work for a state agency or if you know what your state's agency has on this issue, to add data to this, whether it's supporting that this is ubiquitous in your state, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's completely the opposite, and this is really misleading on the scale. Send it to us, and we'll cover it.
Yeah,
as long as it's a reputable source. Again, we did find a couple of other things from a couple of states, but the source that we'd have to go through to use it, I didn't want to in this episode. But I think there is some data from some other states, and if we can get the report or an agency, article on it, then we'll cover it for sure.
Yep. Sounds good.
All right. Well, I guess that was a pretty good episode covering the scale of the feeding.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess we'll move on to, what do you want to do? The aflatoxins next, or just
yeah, I think go into that one, and then I mean, there's a whole host of other, like we said, when you put out that much feed, there's a lot of ecology that you can affect. It changes the system. So, I mean, you've got the aflatoxin, you've got what happens when you concentrate animals, what happens when you make animals more predictable, what happens when you feed other species of animals that interact with turkeys.
Right.
And you just go on down the list.
Well, and, based on the FWC study, they actually asked people, what are the problems that you have associated with your wildlife feeding? And they listed a whole bunch of species. Many of them are turkey predators. And they actually said game species predation was one of the top 5 concerns.
Go figure.
Yeah. So anyway.
All right. All that and more.
Yeah, for sure. And folks out there, if you have questions about this, and I kind of feel like what's going to happen here is we're going to go through a bunch of this, and then a bunch of people are going to have a lot of questions, because I know it's affecting what a lot of folks are doing.
Yeah.
So send those to us, and maybe, if we get enough questions and we feel it necessary, then we can do kind of a recap episode and answer what people are, the questions that people have about this.
Cool. Sounds good. Let us know.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate all the support. Thanks for rating the podcast and leaving us comments and engaging and all that. It's been really awesome. By the way, if you are interested, we've been considering trying to cut in a lot of the imagery and data, the plots and figures and stuff that we cover. It's a lot of work from an editing standpoint. Mm-hmm. But if you are one of those that is watching this on YouTube, or you would like to watch it on YouTube so you can see those visually, let us know. If we start getting a lot of traction through the YouTube channel on these episodes, and we start getting that feedback, we'll put more effort into doing that so that you can get some visuals out of it. I think there is a lot of value in that, but it's just it's time consuming. So if people want to go through that method, that's fine, and we can try to ramp up our effort on it. It's just we're trying to make sure we bring you high quality content in a way that people want to take it in.
Awesome. So appreciate you guys.
Yeah, thanks everybody. We really appreciate it. Talk to you later.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.